in terms of their commitment to the Catholic nature of the institution. I'm concerned about 2 or 3 generations of presidents out, not about the presidents right now. And how do you keep them honest? How do you speak truth to power, to the administration? Especially if they're all lay people on, let's say, the cabinet, and most of them are not Catholic, or the president's not Catholic. Well, how is it going to be maintained as a Catholic institution? So that's basically the thrust of the book. And I think as you, again, think IR, institutional research, how much information is going to be necessary in order to make this work and to get buy-in from different constituencies on campus, particularly the faculty. I don't think you can overestimate the importance of the faculty and the challenge of getting the faculty, for instance, to integrate the Catholic intellectual life into the curriculum. To me, that's the touch point with faculty, that they can talk about the Catholic intellectual life within the curriculum, not just the tradition, the past, but the life now. Catholic intellectual life is something that's vibrant, that's living. It's not just books in the library about Catholicism from the 20th century or before. So that group in particular, I think, presents the greatest challenge. Just one last point, I don't want to go over on this, but in the 1930s, the North Central Accreditation Board was very concerned about the endowment of Catholic institutions. There wasn't much of an endowment. And what they did was call the religious community a living endowment. That lasted for a short period of time. But it was a way for the accreditation to kind of say, well, yes, they have an endowment, but it's a living endowment, it's the religious community. I would propose that the new community, the mission community of today, would really be the new living endowment. That would take up the role that the religious community has, not separate from, but organically connected to the religious community, because the religious community is really the guardian of the charism and the Catholic culture, and you can't do this without a connection to that community. In any case, let me stop there and Mike.
So I think that's a perfect beginning to some of the major themes that are emerging from the book. And so I'd like to get some reflections from Jennifer and Susan as well on some of the main sort of seminal ideas that you'd like to have us kind of follow through this morning and bring us into some conversation. So, Jennifer, you want?
Okay, I'll go. Okay, my concern in the chapter on adult spirituality, which I call Wayfaring at the University, is what I think of in my head as loss of soul in American society. Manifest in many ways. Anxiety, stress, which is always there, but seems more pronounced now. Challenges in the workplace, disagreements internationally, just a lack of deep meaning in society. And my sense is that the university has replicated that, and that the Catholic University has done it in spades because they're trying to stay alive. In order to be viable, you need to recruit students. Haven't been in enrollment management. Many cases represent in order to recruit students more and more better, making something to emphasize. And it's puzzling to me that the only colleges and universities that really advertise Catholic are Ave Maria, Christendom, places that we think of as Catholic, but in a particular way that maybe is not true of our institutions. And why is that? Well, I think it's because there's something deeper than Catholic, forgive me, John, and it is what I think of as sacred humanity. In other words, I think I agree with Carl Jung that the collective unconscious, that there's this deep stream underlying all religions. And in fact, the Vatican has sent certain religious orders in the direction of exploring the deep stream. The interreligious monastic dialogue, which I've become aware of, was mandated after Vatican II, and certainly the Camaldolese, Benedictines, have been meeting with Buddhist monks and other orders of monastics in order to explore that deep stream. And so, just to summarize with a little Parker Palmer, religion, he says, is the organized community of faith, including written doctrines and codes of behavior, whereas spirituality, which I see as that deeper stream stuff, is an ancient and abiding quest for something larger than our egos. In writing my chapter, I used a parable that a lot of us don't know, and I did it on purpose, the Oxfording tale. Why? Because it's new, it's fresh. Sometimes the gospel parables, even though they're tremendously meaningful, these gospels that we've had on Sundays and Lent and Saturdays, sometimes they get a little worn. Also, I wanted to make a commitment to what I really think of as interfaith, sacred humanitas, of the kind of deep well of spirituality that is in all of us, this yearning for meaning. And so I use the Oxfording tale, and I use it because I think of it as a parable of the search for the true self, the soul. And I want to end with just a little quote from Merton about this. Of course, you have to read the chapter to get the whole thing. And this is used by Ilia Delio, who is a new Teilhardian theologian, very well respected. And lo and behold, front of her book, she quotes my favorite quote from Thomas Merton, who is one of my household gods. I can name my household gods later, but Merton is one of them. And this is what Merton says that I think is a way of expressing this true self thing, this soul, that we need to think about how to create, how to encourage on our campuses by measuring practices that really help nurture the soul. What is this soul thing? At the center of our being is a point of nothingness that is untouched by sin and by illusion, a point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God, which is never at our disposal, from which God disposes of our lives, which is inaccessible to the fantasies of our mind or the brutalities of our own will. It is like a pure diamond, blazing with the invisible light of heaven. It is in everybody. And if we could see it, we would see these billions of points of light coming together in the face and blaze of a sun that would make all the darkness and cruelty of life vanish completely. And he ends with something about the gate of heaven, and the gate of heaven is everywhere. So what I think we need to try to do, through surveys, through whatever it is to nourish the ability of people on our campuses to be contemplatives. I myself, having been in religious life and then all these years of administration in colleges, only returned to the feeling that I was called to be more contemplative when my brother got melanoma, and it was really my brother, everyone else is gone, and I was called to figure out, well, what am I going to do? And I decided to pray. And by praying, I decided, well, I'm Catholic, I'll go to Mass. So I started going to Mass. And in the middle of all that, the scriptures just began to sort of speak. And I thought, what am I going to do with this? And then I said, well, I just think this is a call to be a more contemplative person. And so it was kind of a return to an earlier vocation that I had. And I found the Benedictines as a way of being spiritual, following Liturgy of the Hours, Lectio Divina, and praying, taking time to be still. So I think in order to nurture that on campus, we need to encourage thinking and reading around spiritual topics. I like Sacred Humanitas and spiritual in all religions. So feeding the soul, feeding the mind, giving people a chance to step apart and be more contemplative, I think can be done through IR, and I'll get into that. Read the book. Especially my chapter first. I don't have any ego here.
I think, Susan, that it's a terrific model, an aspect in the book that is a part of our identity as Catholic institutions, that is that tradition, that expansive Catholic intellectual tradition, right? That encompasses certainly Catholic social teaching, but is even expansive beyond that. So for you two are both psychologists, anthropologists, theologians, poets. I mean, this is all part of our tradition, right? in a beautiful way. And they have that rooted in some sort of practice of a charism of spirituality in the church. I think it's a beautiful way for us to sort of look at engagement opportunities that our students have, that our staff and faculty participate in. Even for those who don't come out of the religious tradition, but come out of multiple traditions. So thank you for that sort of modeling that engagement and practice of contemplative, thoughtful, interdisciplinary, and sort of transcendent. Jennifer, what would you like to have us think about in particular?
I would just start with a few thoughts. I mean, first and foremost, I know firsthand the value of institutional research and getting things done on campus. Because none of the work that we do at the Higher Education Research Institute in association with Spirituality and Higher Education Project, or more broadly, the Freshman Survey Administration, the Faculty Survey Administration, Senior Survey, you name it, couldn't be done without the heavy investment of institutional research colleagues in your own types of campuses and campuses across the country. So that has been a long-standing awareness of mine with my research institute colleagues. So for that, thank you. You wouldn't have any of the understanding would be nationally of what students look like in terms of their spiritual inclinations or their propensity for wanting to engage in so-called big questions or not for that. And I think, unfortunately, at a lot of campuses, as we go about our daily work, some of that role can be minimized. I know since leaving Harry back in 2006, I became very invested in UCLA and our division of undergraduate education. And at UCLA, you should know, we have 6 IR offices. We don't even just have one. We've got one for student affairs. We've got one for basically graduation and enrollment statistics. We have others for academic affairs, subdivisions thereof. We won't get into how those interact or don't interact, but let's just suffice it to say that we have a lot of data that never gets looked at or merged because it's owned by certain campuses or certain offices within the campus. Now, I don't know how your setups work at your individual campuses, but I know from many phone calls I received when I was at Harry that we would often send reports or data files and they would become filed somewhere, only to be unearthed later by somebody who was new in a role and said, I didn't even know we did this. So I think one of the keys that we really are wrestling with, and I think that fits well with John and Suzanne's interest in engaging in this project, is how do we really use the data and the information that we have? And since transitioning over to a more primarily administrative role at UCLA, first as a special assistant to our Dean and Vice Provost for undergraduate education for issues related to accreditation and using data and informing undergraduate education, and now as an assistant vice provost in that same realm, it really is incumbent upon all of us on campus to figure out, who are our students, who are our faculty, who are our administrators in terms not only of what their credentials are and how they deserve to be there or not, but also this deeper question of who are they, what do they believe, and who do they bring as their best selves to our community, to our campus. And so I think that's really a good starting point for thinking about the issues that John raises in terms of the missions of our respective institutions. And really the broader question that really drove us in undertaking the spirituality project initially what kinds of people will our global society need in the future? Who is it that we want to be educating? How do we want to educate them? And as John and Suzanne both alluded to, the faculty are critical in that. But so is everyone else on campus. If we really think of our campuses as being communities and places for learning and enriching not only the intellectual capacity of our students, but also hopefully their capacities for empathy, for self-awareness, for a greater ecumenical worldview in terms of connecting with others. I think all of these issues are really central. Coming from a public institution, I'm always a little bit envious of people who are at faith-based campuses because it seems to me that you've got a more ready entry point for engaging in those dialogues. But then I also hear that that's not the case sometimes, that there's resistance to doing that because we're not just a religious institution. And the new work that I did on faculty really features that very prominently. Faculty at faith-based institutions, whether Catholic or not, often self-identify as highly spiritual and highly religious, as you might well imagine. But they definitely, in many cases, see a dividing point between who they are individually and what they do professionally. And in a way, in the way that faculty describe it, it's sad that there's this division in who they are. They don't want to reveal that aspect of who they are. And they want to be serious scholars. They don't want to do the touchy-feely work of nurturing student well-being or however they might phrase that. So like it or not, it's a very real tension. And I think there's an interesting avenue in many cases for starting some of this dialogue on campus, both focusing on issues that John highlights in the book, as well as really thinking about at your own particular campus, what do these issues mean? What are these critical points? How do we really engage as a community in supporting the interests of students? And I would argue that one way to do that is to be fully who we are ourselves, and to be self-aware, to be connected, to be respectful of difference. All the ideals that we talk about wanting to sort of promote in our students, I think we need to ask ourselves whether we're in a role as institutional researchers, administrators, faculty, student affairs, whatever it might be. Who is it that we are in our professional lives? And what does that mean in terms of how we interact with colleagues, how we interact with students? How do we really bring who we are to our world of work, into the teaching and learning enterprise? And I think those are conversations that a lot of campuses are very resistant to have. Maybe superficially we talk about those things, but I'd be interested to know from all of you as we continue the conversation today and hear John's and Suzanne's perspective on the feasibility of doing that. And then also beyond national, the last point I wanted to make, beyond national data collection, which is interesting when you can get an institutional report and so forth. What efforts can you engage in on your own campuses that will be most instrumental in moving forward your interests as a campus? And as someone who's heavily involved now at UCLA in accreditation-related pursuits, out of primary necessity, we're all having to be more accountable for who we are and what core competencies are we promoting, how are our students prepared, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who do you want your students at Catholic institution to be? And what are the core competencies besides written communication, oral communication, quantitative reasoning, blah, 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 information literacy, and critical thinking are the other two that we highlighted in the West region. But there's also encouragement to identify other competencies that are essential for students at your institution. And what does that mean in terms of who you are and who you want your students to be at the time they leave your campuses? And then how can the rest of the community support those interests? So that's all I'll say from that. But I would love to hear what you're doing on your own campuses to sort of promote that, or what challenges you experience.
Some of the themes that you draw up with your experience with a national version across institutions, Jennifer, for me is what seems to be a consistent sort of educational theory of sorts that seems to be a challenge for us, is that we are educating individuals, and many times in very individualistic ways. But we're doing that in the community. And not only does the individual reach their fullest capacity through this community, but the intentionality of the quality of that community, or what that community should be or wants to be, it sort of drives the way in which we want to inform ourselves about who we are now, what we want to become, and how do we get there, right? So I think those links to the way in which we're informed along that process by your work is essential for us to understand who we are now, who our constituent partners are, and what makes up all these disparate parts of our community, and how better among sort of thinking that you're learning through your research as well as your spiritual direction, and John, and your kind of thoughtful analysis of your years of mission work, how do we bridge those gaps? You know, we see these sorts of pieces of a puzzle, and how do we make it more coherent? So I think those are challenging. That should keep us alive and in good work for the next couple of decades, hopefully. So as we explore some of those themes of the sort of transcendent realities, our understanding about who we are, how do we understand ourselves, and how do we make sense of that in a culture that's informed by spirituality, by identity, by religious identity, what would you ask each other to sort of engage each other in your own sort of area of expertise? What would you want to learn from each other about some of these topics? So we're gonna sort of model a little bit of questioning, and then you're gonna come into this, okay, pretty quickly. But I thought it'd be an interesting exercise to have the three of you explore maybe one question after each other that can help inform your particular perspective. John, do you want to?
Well, I have a question for Suzanne. When you speak about the importance of spirituality, very often we don't think of it in relationship to ourselves. We're talking about the college or the faculty. And I guess my question to you is, how should institutional research people address the issue of spirituality in their own lives? Or, you know, because you kind of have to start
With yourself.
with yourself.
Absolutely.
So could you expand on that?
Yes, I think, first of all, John, and all of you, I think the project is one that we start with ourselves. We can't expect all those people out there to be people of prayer if we ourselves are not more reflective. And I think that questionnaire that was given at Cabrini is an example of an instrument that pushes in the direction of being more reflective. Are the students reflective? Are they thinking about their religious commitment? But to start with ourselves, I've heard of an organization called Contemplative Mind in Society. And I think if I were an IR person today thinking about where to begin that works for me, I would think of the range of contemplative practices that they suggest. They actually have a tree. It's called the Tree of Contemplative Practices, and I made copies. And while it might be somewhat distracting, actually some are in color, I think it's worth taking a look at, because we don't just think of sitting. It is more than sitting, being a person of contemplation. It could be walking. We could be talking about more reflective study of literature, or many, many things. And I think finding out from the world of contemplative practice what works for us is one way to begin with oneself. And then from the point of view of a campus, I think the question would be, how does my campus encourage some, all, or many of these practices, on our campus? Do we have opportunities? Many of you have talked about retreats. Do we have opportunities for reflective reading? Do we have any possibility of people learning to integrate the body with the soul, yoga, for example, labyrinth walking, meditation walking? What the Contemplative Mind in Society does, and I think it's really an interesting organization. John mentioned them before. We ran into them
I was running a retreat up in Litchfield, Connecticut, or West Cornwall, I guess. And lo and behold, because we didn't fill the whole house, there were 30 of us, there were 50 of them. And who were they? They were higher education people engaged in this process of integrating contemplation into the curriculum. And this organization runs courses in the summer where faculty can learn how to integrate contemplation with their discipline. So I guess my sense of an answer to John's question is that obviously you begin with yourself, but it's a mix of where the rubber hits the road. How does life give me these questions, these challenges that I need something more to answer? How do I live with pain? How do I live with suffering, death? This is the call to the beyond in my mind. You know, it's easy when the days are good and the weather is beautiful. You don't need God. We don't think about God. Well, maybe we do. But then the tough things, you know, I can't communicate with my boss. I can't influence these faculty. I can't solve the illness in my family, or, you know, that's when sometimes stepping back and being able to pray is helpful. And within the Catholic tradition, we have the religious orders, each of which has given us a kind of strength in this area. We tend to go to Buddhism, but really, we have a deep contemplative tradition within Catholicism. We have the Dominicans and their emphasis on the mind in teaching. We have the Jesuits and their emphasis on many things, but among them discernment, retreats. We have the Benedictines with their emphasis on pray and work, the 7 pauses for the Liturgy of the Hours, and the Gregorian chant. So, you know, and on, the Franciscans. Ilia Delio is a Franciscan who is also a pharmacologist and has a doctorate from Fordham, actually, in spiritual theology, and Ewart Cousins was on her committee. The Franciscan love of the earth. And you from each of your religious orders, surely the Cabrini nuns, their devotion to the immigrant, the unserved population. So I know I'm speaking too fast and probably not making much sense, but one thing that occurred to me when I thought of talking with all of you was, you know, these are the measurement people, and this isn't measurable. But then I said, well, what is measurable? Well, what's measurable is the anxiety in the world and the stress and the pain. And what's measurable, my brother is becoming a Knight of Malta, which I thought was really a crazy organization. But I was wrong. There is a spiritual path there. I looked it up. They have a whole section on the underserved populations of the world, and it's very data-driven. So suffering is measurable. What else is measurable? Well, the results of meditation are very measurable. People who meditate seem to have less need for high blood pressure medication and pills, and, you know, so there is an interface. I know I'm rambling. I better stop.
No, that's
while I'm ahead.
That's really, these are very, very concrete descriptions of practice.
That's what I like.
That,
I like this tree.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd climb up that tree.
Yeah. Yeah.
See if somebody would catch me if I came down.
And also from Jennifer's data about faculty, I loved this part, that the people who say they are spiritual, it turns out their teaching is very different. It's more student-centered, more learning-oriented.
Yeah.
That's a mind-boggler.
That's one of the interesting things, and I think my question for both Suzanne and John relates to having been on campuses and doing the work that respectively you've done, and for all of you, is what are really the barriers? I mean, when we see the benefits, I mean, we see that faculty who are more spiritually in tune, for example, who have a greater sense of equanimity, tend to engage with their students very differently. They tend to be much more open to supporting students not only academically but interpersonally in terms of their own growth and development. They tend to be more collegial. I mean, we've seen this, and in the new work that I did on faculty, it comes out in their open-ended comments. I mean, just take the ones who score high in equanimity and you ask them to define success in their career, the value of undergraduate teaching, the answers are so markedly different than those who are lower scorers on those things. Even the people who took the time to answer those questions. You can look at who skipped them, the ones who said this spirituality is ridiculous. I can't believe you're asking these questions. This is all insane. Like, they wouldn't even answer the questions about teaching and learning and success and so forth. So you see the marked differences. I mean, we can think of people we work with on campus who sort of personify the best of what we might like to think our cultures and our campus and our faith represent. So why is it then that this is not more mainstream and more commonplace? Why do we not consider, as somebody asked me at one point, are you advocating that we measure people's spirituality before we hire them? Well, no, I didn't say we should do that. I mean, you know, that's not something particularly, especially a public institution, we would even remotely fathom doing. But why is it that this is such a hard sell on campuses when we see the evidence, and you may see in your own analyses and work and just your own experience, that this is a good thing? Why is it such a difficult thing to do?
And I would ask a question of John along those lines, which is, this seems like a really desperate situation in terms of charism and the continuation of these institutions that are such gems. And remember that Harvard and Yale and such places were all religious in their initial founding. They were seminaries. And look what happened. I mean, they're great places, but are they religious institutions? So John, how do you convince people that this is really a desperate situation? It looks like people in religious orders don't want to face that. And
that's the impression I often get, that religious communities, congregations, don't talk about this very much. They talk about a lay president coming in, but their own role as we go into the future is not something they talk about publicly. I'm sure this is a very difficult issue for them. I know at my own college, when we went to the first lay president, there was a great deal of mourning and grieving in the religious community, because there was no longer a brother as president of Manhattan College. So it's very difficult for that group. And I think one of the examples I think of is an article written by Garrett Hardin called "The Tragedy of the Commons." It was written in 1968 and had 23,000 citations over the last 40 years. But his point was that in English villages, they had a commons where people could bring their sheep to graze. Nobody owned the common, and of course it was to each person's advantage to bring as many sheep as possible. Well, after a while, the commons disappeared because there was no more grazing. It was everything was trampled and eaten up by the sheep and any other cattle that was there. So, you know, it's like climate change. We don't see it, or we don't act. And likewise with the future of the Catholic institution. For instance, the Jesuits have this Ignatian Colleagues program, which is a wonderful program. But unless people can come back to campus and there's a structure where lay people can work with the Jesuits as a community to take responsibility for the future of Jesuit education at that institution, it's scattershot. And I think many religious communities have formation programs like this. People go to them, they love them. The Christian Brothers have wonderful programs, they're very popular, but they come back to the home institution, and it's like in a strainer. You know, they went to the strainer and everything comes out the bottom. I mean, there's no direction forward with this. So I think it's an urgent problem. I think IR people have an important role in pointing out the statistics, the actuarial figures, and just in terms of the religious communities, the average age, how many people are on campus from the religious community. Many people might not know that. How is the process of choosing a new president or provost, how does that go? How are new faculty informed about the nature of the college? The sense of urgency, I think, is very difficult in American society and education because we're so individualistic and we're so silo-oriented, departments, and this is not an issue for us for the academic side. This is student life. Let student life take care of this. Well, I'm not sure what the solution is to get the sense of awareness to be much higher, but I think it's a real crisis, and I don't think it's really being dealt with even by associations, whether it's the Conference of Major Superiors or ACCU or other types of related institutions. So that's my response. It's like the environment. We're facing disaster, and there are some states where they cannot print the scientific reports and distribute them because they've been forbidden by legislatures to talk about climate change and to write about it and to publish it. I mean, even in the federal government, in the Congress, we have the same problem. So I don't know how, unless we have catastrophes to move us, I don't know how we're going to deal with some of these issues, whether it's Catholic universities or the environment or other related problems. We seem to be so ideologically based that we can't seem to come together and talk civilly about these issues, or even believe that they are issues.
So maybe this would be a good point at which we get some of your feedback. One of the things that I'm hearing from the panel is, that we have this landscape, this cultural landscape, this historical legacy of secularization in higher ed that is pervasive across institutions, whether it's religiously affiliated or historically affiliated or never. And what these folks do by their own work and by their own sort of thinking and engagement on these questions is look at what is the reality of that result of this secularization thesis that we've all bought into at some point. How might you, as anthropologists and sociologists and statisticians, how might you provide some dashboard measures, and what measures might help us to get a sense of where we are as participants in that secularization thesis? But then how does it kind of move us in a direction where we can begin to address the questions in some productive, whether it's formation programs or faculty development or pedagogical approaches. But what might be some of those dashboard measures for us to get a handle on where we are right now? And I ask this in a biased way because I think all of you come from an optimistic point of view on this. As much as climate change, we have to come to the reality. But so we're here to be agents of change and participants in some sort of future to these questions. But what are the measures that you think would be appropriate, that would inform our trustees, inform our seniors, inform our practitioners? What are some of those measures that you're already providing?
I wonder if
reflection, have a little conversation with the folks here.
I wonder if the group would be willing or able to talk a little bit about how the landscape of the families of the students who are entering Catholic higher education have changed. Those of us who are of a certain age, less hair, dark, whatever, had a very different family tradition of church than I think is true of many of the students who are appearing on our campuses today. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of that and about the ways in which, because that becomes a measurable thing, I think we could at least get something around. We could know something about family practice, and then the way in which campuses might respond. I'm thinking of my last theology faculty, where they often threw up their hands saying, I don't know how to teach Theology 1 to this group of students. Some of them went to very good Catholic high schools and were bored to tears. Some of them had only a touch of religious education as teenagers, and really were very confused. And some of them had no background at all and were resentful of the fact that the institution asked them to spend time, yet they were all in the same classroom together. If you could talk, I wandered a little bit, but if you could help us think a little bit about that particular phenomena, I think that would be of help to the group.
So I guess who are our students, and what are the trends as we see our constituent, our primary constituent?
Well, our particular studies haven't looked in any depth, if at all, at the family experiences of students coming in. I do know, having interacted with people at various campuses, that a lot of what you're saying, resonates in terms of if it's a faith-based institution, particularly at some of the less elite campuses that have had to broaden their student population. They have a number of students, if you take, for example, Catholic institutions that are not Catholic, and that sort of resent the fact, as you said, that there would be any sort of indoctrination to any particular faith tradition when they're in college. Others of us would say that's insane. I mean, if you go to a Catholic institution, you would expect there's some element of Catholicism, if not a heavy dose of that particular faith tradition. You see it also among the faculty, and that's where it's freshest in my mind, that this recent project that I did involved faculty responses, roughly 10,000 of them. And they were faculty who worked at all different sorts of institutions. And it was remarkable to me to see comments from faculty who are employed by Catholic institutions or others, but I'm focusing on the Catholic at this point, who say, I think it's absolutely ridiculous that we've got Mass on campus, or I think that it's asinine that we would be talking with students about these issues. It's inappropriate. This is an academic institution. It's like, but you're at a Catholic school. I mean, how can you think that? I was staggered when I saw it. Although it resonated with what we've heard in earlier stages of the project. I will say that most abhorrent, at least to faculty, are people who identify as spiritual but not religious. That they would rather, even at a public institution, have somebody say, I'm very religious, than this kind of mushy spiritual but not religious stuff, as they refer to it. That this kind of squishy nonsense of, why would you be spiritual without any kind of particular faith tradition is just craziness. And by extension, those of us who have engaged in national studies, to keep things nameless, of spirituality, that what are you trying to advance a notion of spirituality outside of a particular faith? That's, of course, you're from the West Coast doing that, because that's where that kind of thing would happen. It's an interesting, so people who do come, whether it's students who come from a strong faith tradition, whether it's faculty, and I would say that it's safe to assume you could project at administrators or staff, who come from a strong faith tradition, whatever institution they might be employed at or enrolled at as students, tend to sometimes have preconceived notions of what that faith should be and what that education should look like. And if it deviates from that, if we start talking about, for example, contemplative practice that isn't prayer, why is that? Because we would know that prayer is what you should be doing. So our own biases, and that relates a lot to how we've grown up, the environments in which we've been raised, and I would say as much as anything, the rigidity of those environments. To not understand that, well, I may believe this, my family may believe X, Y, Z, whatever that may be, other people feel differently. And one of the things that we know for students is that exposure to the other, whether it's within your dorm life, whether it's in your academic classrooms, your extracurricular activities, if you have the privilege of studying abroad, of engaging in community service, those are the real eye-opening experiences, right? They're discombobulating in the sense that, my gosh, I thought everybody believed like I do or my family does, but that's not true. And then beyond that, not only is that not true, but there's value in what other people think and believe. Even if I don't plan to throw away everything I believe and adopt their practices and beliefs, It's important to learn and to understand and recognize that my way, my worldview, as it might be, isn't the only one. And not only is there value in recognizing that, but there's richness and growth and a lot of positivity that can come from that. Not ignoring one's own traditions or background. But I think that your question about the the family experience and who those students are is critical. The other thing that I think relates to that is the notion that at least on many campuses, we've got more first-generation students coming to college than ever before. And the mindsets, the beliefs, the practices, the ways of knowing what's valued, it can be very different than the upper middle class, traditional sort of normative student population that has been the majority on many of our campuses. Similarly, for faculty of color, spirituality tends to play an enormously important role, whatever particular faith they may have. And that's another dimension of marginality on campuses, that's not respected, it's not valued. So again, talking about accepting the whole person, whether it's students, whether it's faculty, administrators, we're more complicated than what's on our CV or on our admissions essay application materials. And it's taking the time to get to know, in all its complexity and messiness and diversity, who we are as individuals and as a community. And it's hard to do that. I mean, there are a lot of barriers that come into play. But understanding the family traditions, not only I would say for students, but also faculty. Who are you? Where do you come from? What's important to you? And what uniquely do you bring to this environment? And how can we value that, recognize it, celebrate it, and accept who you are, as you are, without feeling a need to change you and make you like us or make you like me. And that's a very difficult line to walk in many institutions.
Just one further point on the family. The new majority at our colleges will be Hispanic.
Right.
And I think the lack of understanding of Hispanic culture on the part of admissions officers or the faculty, administrators, is extremely important. And here again, IR can play an extremely important role. There are studies out there about the structure of Hispanic families. People on campus should know about those things. For instance, there's a professor in religious, I think he's in religious studies at BC, Osman Espino, who's one of the most eloquent spokespersons about Latinos and Catholics' education and Catholicism. If you need someone to come to your campus to talk about this, to convince people, he's the guy to do it. And, let's face it, this is not going to be a majority white country after 2050. And one of the reasons Catholicism seems to be growing is because of the influx of Hispanics. And at the same time, a lot of them are leaving the church because they find a cold shoulder. So I think in terms of families, this is an extremely important group that we need to pay attention to, and I think it's a role that you in particular have to play in making this conscious awareness on the part of the institution. I'm sorry?
Who's that author?
Osman Espino.
Osman Espino, who's a School of Theology and Ministry. He just completed a national study of Hispanic ministry in which he looked at parish life, individual communities within diocesan structures. But the questions are, how do these communities engage ministry, spiritual life, participate in those communities, and have something, obviously, that to contribute in a distinct way to the way in which we're engaging or not being engaged by them and with that. So a terrific set.
I have just a couple comments about the student and the family. I mean, one thing, it would be good to find out if you were an IR person. It would be good to convince someone that it's important to figure out what the questions are of your students as they come into the institution. Now, some of that information comes, I guess, from the freshman survey.
But not,
you can add those questions to find out what are their needs as they approach campus? What are their questions? What are the faculty's questions? I have one little story about this kind of thing, and it's from the College of St. Catherine. You probably have heard that they're doing, I think there's a course called The Reflective Woman. And the little story I read was about a student who came to the campus, self-proclaimed atheist, who took the course and was beginning to get fascinated by this College of St. Catherine, 100 years old, first Phi Beta Kappa institution in the United States. And part of The Reflective Woman was to do oral histories about the College of St. Catherine, how it emerged, how it grew, how the St. Joseph Sisters of Carondelet had founded it, talking to different, and the girl, even though she was an atheist, and it seemed like continuing to be one, was, intrigued by all of this. And I kind of wonder if there's any role for oral history in your work, any role for qualitative research, or if most of the research is quantitative. I don't know. It's probably a luxury to do qualitative research. Things like interviews, one-on-one, but it's research, folks. I took a course in it at Columbia, so I know it counts. Any of you do anything like that? Oral history? Got any of that on campus? No, because you're trying to do that other stuff. You've got the iPads, the accreditation visit, you don't have that luxury, do you? Can you choose?
But we can partner with people.
You can.
I think that on our campus, that
Partner with faculty who might be
interested. When we did our mission, massive focus on all constituents, and there was so much dialogue that we recorded everything and transcribed 40,000 words of wisdom.
Oh my goodness.
So we could really see the student thought, and although our mission statement didn't change a lot, we all knew that we were committed then, and that we had taken part in this.
Yeah, it's the process. Can you summarize that stuff and get it out so people?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to say one thing apropos of that, and I think I've been as guilty of this as anyone in my business. The notion of how we communicate what we find to various groups, and I think when you look at the campus environment just as a focal point, a lot of, I think, the survey fatigue and the resistance to want to take the time to fill out a survey or to answer, even a question that comes via email, whether it's open-ended or multiple choice, whatever it might be, is that we don't really know what happens to that information after we offer it. And, here's another survey I filled out, or here's another question I've answered, and goodness knows what the campus is doing with it. If you can find mechanisms and meaningful ways to feed back even a brief summary of what the findings are, appreciating that no matter what you do, people can criticize it. This isn't comprehensive enough, I would have focused it this way, I would have made it look different, I didn't like the colors you used, whatever it might be, fine, that's always going to happen. But just especially, I think, with students and faculty, to say, here's what you told us, here's what we understand from it, and what else should we know? And I know some of you are doing that on campus, and I can't underscore the value of making the time to do that and helping your senior administrative colleagues understand the importance of that. I mean, UCLA, we always are surveying the students, and we rarely tell the students what we found based on, or what we're going to do with this. Here's another set of questions we're asking you. We're not going to answer that. You asked us something similar last year, and we never heard anything more about it. So we're really trying on our own campus to do a better job of that. And with the resources tight and the busyness and the accountability, it's sometimes hard to do that. But data can be a great starting point for dialogue. And one of my favorite things I ever heard was when we visited Carnegie Mellon years back. And their president was very involved at the time in trying to understand who their campus, or who the people of their campus were relative to what people externally thought they were about. And his motto was, "In God we trust, all others bring data." Now, that's great, bring data, but data can be a great starting point for discussion. You can say to people, X% of our students say this related to our mission or to their own spiritual growth. Does that resonate with what your experience is interacting with them? If not, why not? If you think the question was flawed in the way we ask it, how should we ask it differently? and to really grow a thick skin about the criticism you will absolutely receive when you open up your findings for dialogue. That's great. I mean, just put it aside, treat yourself to a great dinner afterwards. Appreciate that sort of vitriol that no one can bring like faculty. I still maintain that they're good. They're articulate, they're engaged, they're intellectually driven, and they can pick apart anything, no matter what it is. But putting that in perspective, you can also learn a lot and get a lot of people engaged who otherwise will not entertain a thought about whatever the topic might be, whether it's spirituality or anything else. So taking those risks and taking the time and investing in the resources to do that can go a long way in making progress.
And I guess if we are contemplative ourselves, we'll be less inclined to take that vitriol personally.
Yeah, maybe not.
No, I mean, you can work on it. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
an area to work on.
Yeah.
Well, Louise, just to
Spiritual
follow up
growth.
on that point, how will a deeper spirituality on your part inform your work? We talked about worldview yesterday. Well, it would seem to me that if we really are serious about the spiritual journey, and it might not be Catholic, but if we become more spiritual or more contemplative, that's going to have a profound effect on how you do your work in IR, the types of questions you might ask, the interpretations you give of data. So I don't think spirituality is like a separate track. It really becomes the foundation for the work that you do. And at the Vatican Council, the council called for the holiness of all people, not just clergy or religious, but all people are called to holiness. And I think, practically speaking, it means developing a deep sense of spirituality and a spiritual worldview. And that will inform your work.
For one thing, you'll be happier, because in every instance you're saying, where is God in this for me? It's not just like, oh my gosh, I had an accident, I'm really in trouble. No, what is the call in this situation? What is the call? Where is God in this for me? And it kind of makes everything better, I'll have to say. We're not optimists, we're people of hope, right?
Well, I sort of take away that the data can be holy. And Mark, I suggest that, there's that famous motto on the east door of the Sacred Heart Basilica, Notre Dame, God, country, Notre Dame. You might want to scratch in God, data, Notre Dame. But I know we have some more questions.
I just have a comment in response to your question about what questions we should be asking, but it's also a bit of a commentary. I'm a clinical psychologist besides an IR person, and there are very few occasions on which I can put the two together, but this actually happens to me. So I'm going to start out by complimenting the panel. This has been an amazing presentation and discussion and enlightening for me. But earlier on, we talked about we must look to ourselves. As a clinician, I say, we got to change ourselves. Changing others is really close to quixotic work. Change yourselves and other people respond. In answer to your question, Michael, there's a sense to which we must look to ourselves, and I would say look to the members of this panel. I have known you directly or indirectly, most of you, for many years, and my clinician's hat bill goes off and says these are people with integrity. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean integrity in terms of honesty versus corruption and those types of things, but leading fully. Yes, that's not. I'm looking at a deeper question. Are you full people, and do you live according to principles, personality traits that apply across all the situations that you are in? Are you the same person in every setting that you are in, essentially, at your core? As institutions, higher education does not allow faculty members to do that. They are either research machines or non-productive researchers in many cases and not rewarded for what they do. If So we've actually set up a system of incentives which prevents them from engaging with students as full persons. When Catholic institutions, in the presence of members of religious orders at institutions diminished, the presence of full persons on the faculty diminished. Because the members of the religious orders both had time because they were celibate and all that type of stuff, but also the spiritual training in depth, and were called and expected to be full persons and fully present with the students and to foster their spiritual as well as their intellectual development. In our teaching, we are so focused on the cognitive parts of life that we don't allow the students to become it drives me crazy when I observe students trying to make career choices as they go from college where they might have learned these ideals and then have to find an occupation where they can apply gospel values. And we're in New York City, or border from New York City. That's not an easy thing, because what Wall Street is looking for is your primary value is to make money and win competition. That's not a gospel value, to my knowledge. But I don't see this explicitly, and I don't see faculty members, in fact, they are repelled by the idea of addressing these kinds of questions. Again, it is part of the incentive system that we create. So my thought is, and this is not fully formulated, is if we look at what having integrity means, are there questions that we could derive? Did you learn? Did you have occasion to apply what you learned in the ethics courses, or however you want to formulate the question? In your volunteer activities, did you take into account these values when you were contemplating career choices, when you were interviewing? Did you ask any questions related to these, to whether the environment in which you are going to place yourself is allowing you to live a life consistent with it? Are you making choices consistent with these values? But it's just in listening to you and observing you, I'm kind of thinking almost the theme, the guiding light behind me is a life of integrity, because it is with considerable pain that I have seen both administrators and faculty members not live lives of integrity in my career, and then I've seen some that can. And those are the transformative people, people that have transformed me, that have enabled me to be a fuller person, are the people who, by and large, have lived lives of integrity. But I have a conflicting thought with all this. In the interest of full disclosure, I've paid for myself with that. I have been, I spent I did one of my degrees is from Stanford. There was a case where you had the faculty members that were super productive in terms of research. The place practically vibrated with intellectual ideas and fertility. You just couldn't walk down the hall and not encounter from a student or a faculty member some really new idea that, having been out 30 years now, that was a new idea and it took hold. And that was, at the same time, you had faculty members there that exhibited the personal care for students that you would find in the best Catholic university that's living up to gospel values. It is not clear to me how that works. It's partly because a place like Stanford has the capacity and the money to hire the best of the best of the best, and they do. So there is this resource issue, and that's, we all know when we think about enrollment management, the demands there, and have that they compromise on integrity and everything else. There's that question of resources. So this is not that simple. But kind of my vision is if you can take the survey, and if you can give the evidence that something that you value is not happening, what are the discrepancies between our ideals and our practices, and you put that in front of people, my hope is that, as institutional researchers, one might be able to begin. You're not strategizing, you're not forcing change, you're not strategically sitting behind there saying this is the way it's all going to work out. What you're simply doing is putting information in front of people and trusting that you will call for their integrity and their ideals and say, gee, we ought to be doing something differently because we show them this information, even though it may be embarrassing, even though we might not be able to show it to prospective students or whatever. But I'm just coming back to this notion of integrity and the way the people that we value behave and conduct themselves and what they show in their lives. And, I think the four of you really are good examples of that, and I suspect that many people in this room are also.
How do you respond to, either in your own observations of faculty life and this sort of coherent self, or the impediments about it today?
Say that again, Mike.
Well, I think my simplistic summary of an eloquent description of the incoherence that we see in the way in which we live in the academic life. While we have this call for the holistic development of the person, we don't, nor do our academic structures allow for that easily.
I think what you said is right on target. First, thank you for saying it, but I think that this notion that we reinforce in the academy behaviors that we might not resonate with personally, in the interest of professional growth and resources and reputation, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I heard from faculty in this most recent foray was, the notion that there's just no time for these sorts of things. This is trivial relative to what my work is at the university. So it really is how we construct our identities, professionally, and who we see ourselves as, both in terms of our value to the institution and in most cases our value to the academic community more broadly. For most faculty who are engaged in any sort of research, the external community is the real source of validation, not so much the immediate campus community. So if you're a striver professionally, these colleagues, whatever, they're just here. I've got to impress the group out here. So yeah, that's the guild is what John just said, that the orientation is not to my campus community, it's to my disciplinary affiliation and to being known and to being recognized, and that's going to get me ahead at my institution. So there's something inherently backwards about that. And in this era where it's more difficult now to sort of jump from place to place to place, resources are not as plentiful as they were at one point. We need to think about where we are and how we can contribute where we are, and bring kind of the best elements of our work and our capacities there. I would say that Stanford is an interesting case of people being inspiring and motivated by ideas and the intellect. I think you can find those sorts of dynamics at any campus, whether it's the most elite or the most mundane in terms of the hierarchy of institutions. The problem for me is that it's so idiosyncratic. At any institution, you can see somebody at Stanford who's had a horrific experience, and someone who's had an amazing experience. Same thing at a college that most of us may never have heard of. And so the challenge is, how do we help ensure that more students have transformative experiences, that more faculty at all institutions are soundly grounded in a sense of equanimity and feeling good about who they are, so that they can then bring that part of themselves to other people. And that, I think, is a really, really difficult question to answer. And the answers to that are different at all different types of campuses. But it's critical to ask that. How do we best take care of our campus community? Maybe it's attending to our own sort of spiritual growth and our sense of community and so forth.
I don't think the problem is just with the campus and these contradictions and helping the students, but they come from a wider world than our bucolic campus. And the contradictions they face there are enormous. We all face them. The trust in institutions, our Congress, ideology in government, our role in the world as the United States. What is it? What should it be? The competing values of nationalism and tribalism, ethnic conflict. It's a swirl. the Catholic Church, Catholicism. We're faced with enormous issues off the campus that penetrate the campus, and this issue of competition. I saw a headline in Manhattan College's website last night, Manhattan among the top 10 in return on investment. Well, it's become that now. What is the return on investment? And after a while, you have to say there's something wrong. And it has to do with civil society, not just with the college experience, and where are we in terms of understanding our civil society and supporting it. So Gerald Grafe, who taught for years at the University of Chicago, he always talked about teaching the conflict. This is about culture studies and the culture wars. You have to bring that into the classroom and teach the conflict. I think we have to bring all this stuff into the classroom and talk about the issues that we all face, faculty as well as students, and the issues on a college campus are a microcosm. This is the real world. The college campus is the real world. We're not preparing students for the real world. How do we address all these conflicts? How do we live with them? How do we develop a sense of equanimity? To go back to Suzanne's point about spirituality, one of the reasons this contemplative outreach, it's all secular institutions that belong to this association. Contemplative mind. No Catholic institutions. It's based in Northampton at the...
Wilson? No. It's a standalone.
But it's at Amherst. It's based at Amherst. And it spreads like wildfire, because what they're getting the kids to do is sit down and just be quiet at the beginning of the class.
But within the discipline, figuring out how to integrate that into the discipline. See, I think the problem with faculty, and this wonderful, thank you for your contribution about, I'm embarrassed, our integrity, who knows. But anyway, with regard to faculty on our campuses, the reward system does not really help them. What are faculty evaluated on? Scholarship, research, and teaching. In what amounts, correct? I mean, service, right,
but
service.
Scholarship.
But then, who rewards dealing with students in a personable way? John is my example in this regard, because I personally go to the supermarket, get my stuff, and leave. John will say to the woman or kid at the cashier, "Purple hair, that's so interesting. Where did you have it done? How long have you had this purple hair?" Or a tattoo, that I'm thinking, tattoo, piercing. Oh, John will say, "It's just such an interesting design." And the kid lights up. The accent, could you be from Ethiopia? Yes, I'm from Ethiopia. How did you know? Well, but engaging people, that's not rewarded, is it? It might be in some institutions among administrators, and everybody knows this is a great people person, but in terms of the faculty, in terms of the department, I don't think that's rewarded. And how can we change that reward system? How can IR people influence? I mean, it's like everything. What kind of influence do I have? Well, I have some convictions. I have someone I report to. I can pass on that idea. Ideas can be very powerful. I think at Manhattan College, they really do have an emphasis on dealing with the students as children of God. There's a lot of people stuff, and they do it very well. And they seem to graduate kids who are intellectually adept and socially very able to deal with the workplace and with other people, and to really love and respect, each individual. But changing the reward system for faculty so that, that is more universal. I don't know. Are we dealing with original sin? Is the devil out there?
So we have time for, I think, 2 more questions, and I know, Jerry, Who's
Yeah, I
also
was
not
just
afraid
going
of
to make a
tattoos.
comment, reinforce what Don said, and thank the panel so much for being here. What occurred to me is we're dancing around Boyer's 4 scholarships. We ask the right questions to create information. We communicate that, as Jennifer says, through reporting and the importance of communicating. We critique the knowledge, but above all else, we're responsible frequently for integrating the knowledge, because we bridge between the administration, between the faculty, between the students. We're one of the few really significant bridging functions. In order to be successful at that, we cannot tolerate being relegated to hired guns. We have got to continue to work to get a seat at the table where strategic discussions are being made. In order to get there, we have to educate ourselves. We have to look at Teranzini's levels of intelligence and understand issues and our institutions. Thank you again for being a panel.
Thank you.
We have the 2 marks here who are you can fight out for it. Mark 1, Mark 2.
I was just thinking of this notion, I'm not a storyteller, but you've heard before, I think the idea that 3 people can be doing the same thing, but for different purposes, like this, am I moving bricks, am I building a wall, or am I building a cathedral? Right? And part of what spirituality, I think, is about the end, that you have the end in mind, that you're working towards some larger purpose. It seems to me that's part of what we're doing as Catholic institutions, ideally, and one of the greatest gifts that we can give is that we orient students towards something bigger than themselves, right? Towards a project, towards a mission, towards a sense of vocation that goes beyond simply getting the degree or learning the skill, that it's oriented towards the common good. And that helping them understand that in order to sustain that vocation and that mission, you need habits and practices that help you do that. You need a community of people around you that are going to help keep you accountable to that mission. And that's at the best what we do. And I circle back because I was struck by Jennifer's question at the beginning. What are the competencies? And I at once am attracted to and resist that question because I think sometimes, to reduce faith to a competency can, somehow doesn't feel quite right to me. And yet, what is it that we're trying to do as Catholic institutions? What competencies are we seeking to develop in students that help orient them towards something else? And again, just to wrap up, ultimately, we're, I don't want to say only as good as, but what is the most telling of who we are as an institution is who walks out of our door, right? When they walk out, our graduates are our best, example of who we're about and what we're trying to do. And hopefully they model what we hope the values are that we're trying to convey. And I hope we're doing something that is distinctive and not just something, so often we're just trying to imitate the best practices of higher education without saying, but okay, a lot of that's good, but what we're trying to do is build a cathedral. You know what I mean? Like we're oriented towards the common good and doing something beyond just producing people who are good at their discipline. We're trying to do more than that.
I want to pose a question that I know there is not time for the answer. But I am struggling with the overlap of or intersection of something of spirituality and religiosity, particularly in the Catholic context. I was struck by something, Jennifer, that you did in your chapter, that you said that in the spirituality study, the emphasis was not on how students define their spirituality or how they make meaning of their lives, simply just how intensive that is it. And then, of course, there are the scales, which tells us a lot, I think, probably answering how people define spirituality, more than not. But I'm also hearing this conversation from the point of view of, the California thing, like, well, I'm sorry, let me just get to this. I'm afraid that either the spirituality approach to this is dead on and everything else is absolutely wrong, or it's a smokescreen for, I'm not practicing my religion. I don't want to look like I'm throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so I'll say I'm spiritual minded. And particularly because we're embarking on this project to help develop indicators for Catholic identity and mission effectiveness, I think we're going to have to grapple with this. Do we take the crucifixes down and just, put up amethyst and hematite and make it all work and say this is where we really are, the sacred humanity? Is that really it? And the church is nothing but a confining box that can't get it right? I don't know. But I think that if we're going to make the argument that we are Catholic institutions and that means something, there are really difficult questions about the intersection, overlap, and perhaps even conflict between spirituality. So
There's a time I yield a terrific piece on sort of methodologies of inquiry about spirituality and religion, in which there's a great discussion that looks at the nuances. It's not in this book, but there's another.
We've looked at the measures we talked about.
Right, but in that, there's a nice weaving of a discussion about how we're attentive to the nuances of not completely separating those two.
Yeah.
What the terminology isn't always getting at this clean separation that we can, I think we can easily sort of hide behind.
And what we do on a national level, inquiring about spiritual and or religious, I think necessarily needs to be is different than what a group of campuses of a certain type would do. Maybe using some of that and saying other parts of it aren't relevant for what we're doing here, and we need additional questions, or we need to delve into certain aspects more. I think that's perfectly appropriate. I don't think a one-size-fits-all is in any way appropriate.
I wouldn't want to mislead people by my emphasis on spirituality, that I de-emphasize religion in any way. My personal view is that everyone needs and has a deep religious commitment, and that one's personal spirituality, which also could be communal, complements that, but that it's a big mistake to abandon one's religious roots. And in fact, it probably can't be done. If you were brought up, if you've read Judith Plaskow, she's a feminist Jewish theologian. Well, she was brought up in a very traditional Jewish household, and she thought, well, this doesn't mesh because, women can't do it. She couldn't get rid of it. It's too deep in her. Our religious roots, coming from the family, I think, and from our upbringing, are too deep, and they're too important at Catholic institutions to be abandoned. I think they're enriched by delving into the spirituality that is also Catholic, and that is, if you're Catholic. But if you're Buddhist and you're at a Catholic institution, it's sort of frosting on the cake to have offerings. I think the University of San Diego does this, doesn't it, John, in their campus ministry? They service the range of religions that are available in Georgetown, while emphasizing that they're a Catholic institution. So I don't know what kind of measures you can develop from that. It's sort of not my area, but I think it needs to be respected, the deep religious.
I am trying to figure out, in Lisa's presentation yesterday, there was a category of religious but not spiritual.
Yeah.
I'm just still trying to figure out.
Right.
Sure.
The 1%,
All right.
2%, yeah.
I think it's, sometimes if people say that, and we're looking at students, college students, that it's their bridge. I think we can't forget that they're still young.
Yeah.
And it's their way of saying, I'm independent, but it's also that they're searching. And if we think of Erickson's stages,
Yeah.
it's, people are afraid, oh, they lose their Catholicity, because of college. It's not that. It's they're searching and they become it maybe later. But they're discerning.
Yeah.
And it's their way of saying, well, I have these roots.
It's an identity issue.
It's
Yeah.
So
And-
it's fresh, it's good, it's a search.
I know we're running really short, but I can tell you from the way faculty, I did a little sort of compilation of what does it mean to be religious, what does it mean to be spiritual in this open-ended thing with faculty. The spiritual but not religious faculty, which are roughly 1 in 5, are people primarily that were raised in a faith tradition, whatever it might be, and had very negative experiences in association with that. So they don't identify themselves as religious because they have negative connections, but from that broader doctrine, they do view themselves as spiritual, as connected to something greater than themselves. Don't necessarily have a problem with God. It's the doctrine of the church, whatever that might be, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, et cetera, et cetera. The religious not spiritual, which are like 1 or 2%, are typically evangelical Christian, white males who believe that spirituality is just a crock for the West Coast crazies, and who really say that my religion is my religion, and spirituality is just a passing trend, new age, not for me. So they tend to be very religious, particularly.
Mark, following up on that, Ross Dotat, who's a columnist in the Times, wrote an article last week on penumbra Christians. And what they are religious, but not spiritual. In other words, they talk a good line, they go to church, but they don't practice it. So they're kind of on the penumbra. And I think
they tend to be low in equanimity. They tend to be low in quest. They're very defined.
They have the
They have the answers.
answers.
They're absolute in their beliefs and their faith. There is no question. There is no divergence. This is the way it is, and everything else is wrong. They're a very distinct group and very small in the faculty population, but very vocal. Well, you aspire to whatever you want, but I mean, it's not a mindset I resonate with particularly, but I was thrilled they were in the survey.
How did they get elected to Congress?
Anyway, they were there.
John and I went to a workshop at Fordham, quickly, just to talk about it. It was called What Do Spiritual Seekers Have to Teach Religious People? Very good panel, a guy from Georgetown and 2 women who were excellent, one from Duke who runs the spirituality program. And basically, spiritual seekers have a lot to teach religious people in that they think churches are there to raise money to pay salaries and build buildings, and they don't like that. And there are certain values. I mean, it's not a bad question. What do spiritual seekers have to teach religious people? There are answers.
Great. So this is going to carry us through the next couple of months and years, right? Next time we convene, another wonderful opportunity a year from now to return to this room, but also our conversations among colleagues. So I offered you the book and Jennifer's forthcoming or just recently published book.
January.
In January.
It's here.
And then I also suggest a book that I found very fascinating on this question about sort of convergence of spiritual religious identification of that. Nancy Ammerman from Boston University, sociologist of religion, just published a book called Sacred Stories and Spiritual Tribes, Everyday Stories of Religious People. And it's a fabulous read. It's a narrative inquiry from a diversity of individuals looking for religious experience in everyday life. And she's found that this category of spiritual but not religious is referred to by many of her respondents as someone else who has that perspective. But this isn't necessarily a lived reality. It's a coherent way in which people actually live their lives. But it's a category that they feel applies to someone else. Well, someone else makes sense out of it, but it doesn't make sense out of it. So it's a great piece.
What's the name again?
It's called Spiritual Stories. Sacred Stories and Spiritual Tribes. Yes, Sacred Stories and Spiritual Tribes. Religious Identity in Everyday Life. Nancy Ammerman.
And I would say we should not forget that cultivation of spirit is still
Absolutely.
seminal work.
Thank you.